Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I am just very pleased to welcome you to the 2024 edition of our Old Parkland Conference, focusing on the condition and progress and success and challenges still to come for African Americans in the United States. We started this 2 years ago here. We have something about weather with this conference. That first attempt, we were faced with ice, and it was challenging and difficult and hard, and we had a sort of false start. We did it a little bit, and then we came back a month later and did the full conference. And as I was flying in today from El Paso, and the pilot was saying there's weather coming, and it was pouring rain, and I said to myself, this better not happen again. But then when I got out of the plane, as you all know, the temperature was a little higher, and I gathered Dallas can handle rain, at least when it doesn't freeze. And so this is an important conference to all of us at AEI and to our colleagues and friends and partners at the Manhattan Institute and at Hoover. When I started at AEI, I felt strongly that it was important for institutions like the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington-based think tank in the Northeast, looking at the big issues, to reach out beyond the world in which we operated in mostly, and learn about and study and think about the issues and challenges facing people who weren't necessarily like us, and maybe not always had gotten a fair shake in the United States. And my colleague at Manhattan Institute, Raihan Salam, agreed, and Condi Rice agreed, and so we put this conference together to bring thinkers and scholars and writers and public intellectuals to talk about those issues in a serious way, and then develop friendships and a network and a community that could take those ideas that we learned about and those conversations out into the country to make our country even better than it already is. And that's what this is about. That's what we're doing. That's what we did 2 years ago. That's what we're about in our respective institutions. That's what we believe in. And that's why we're very pleased to have you join us and be part of us and get to know us. Now, this particular conference is really outstanding. I should also point out to those of you who are new to our community that AEI and Manhattan and Hoover are academic institutions. And so when we gather, you might not necessarily hear the typical sort of political fireworks that you hear on CNN or Fox. You're going to hear maybe a little drier, but we think more significant and more important discussions of real data and real issues and really long-term challenges for our country. And so the fact that we have Roland Fryer and Raj Chetty and Raihan Salam and the other scholars that we have here, Coleman Hughes, is really a remarkable gathering. Charles Murray, all together talking about these issues. Ian Rowe from the American Enterprise Institute is really remarkable. And I want you to give us a chance in the next, tonight, tomorrow, hold your judgment until you've seen the whole thing. Because when you see the whole thing, you're going to say, that's a remarkable gathering of people who love America, want to talk to each other in a reasonable and positive way about how we can make our country better. And so I welcome you all in that spirit, with a particular expression of affection for my colleague, Raihan Salam, the president of the Manhattan Institute, who did so much to make this program a success, and our respective staffs who helped pull this together, and of course the people here at Old Parkland who make it all so nice. So the last thing I'll just say is, I want to, maybe this will give you a sense of how I see the world these days. I don't know if Raihan will agree with me on this, but we gathered together recently and I said, at this conference we're going to have some people that represent the views of the major party candidates for President of the United States. So we're going to have some people here that are going to speak and represent the views of President Trump and his campaign. And we'll have some people here who speak and represent the views of President Biden and his campaign. And then we'll have people here who represent the views of the 70% of Americans who don't like either. So with that, I welcome you, I greet you. A little bit later, Raihan will be called up to do the first conversation But enjoy your meals and welcome to Old Parkland. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to keeping America and its great cities prosperous, safe, and free. We're honored and delighted to be partnering with the American Enterprise Institute and the Hoover Institution on this year's Old Parkland Conference, and grateful to all of you, and especially to our friends, Kathy and Harlan Crow, for making this event possible. We at the Manhattan Institute are committed to the ideal of a colorblind society. Yet the fact remains that race is a powerful force in American life, especially for Black Americans. To critics on the left, the persistence of Black disadvantage is an indictment of American institutions, from our constitutional structure to our commitment to private property and economic freedom. To Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michelle Alexander, Jamel Bouie, and other celebrated intellectuals on the racial left, the only way to overcome anti-Blackness is to radically remake American society and to firmly entrench race consciousness into every aspect of public policy. But there's another tradition of Black moral and political thought, one that rejects the left's emphasis on redistribution and reparations in favor of a more conservative vision of racial uplift. It is that tradition that inspired the 1980 Black Alternatives Conference at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, a gathering of Black intellectual luminaries who dissented from the racial orthodoxies of their time. Building on that legacy, this year's Old Parkland Conference is focused on spurring the economic and social advancement of Black Americans through self-help, entrepreneurship, cultural renewal, and the evidence-based optimization of talent. To that end, we've assembled a number of America's most incisive public intellectuals to think openly, honestly, and deeply about the state of Black America and how we might foster the further advancement of Black Americans. As we approach the 60th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we have cause to celebrate the enormous progress Black Americans have made in education attainment, economic outcomes, and cultural and political influence over the intervening years. Despite a history of slavery and segregation, the United States is home to the most affluent, educated, diverse, and dynamic population of African descent in the world, one that is being replenished and enriched by hundreds of thousands of immigrants every year. Ours is a history marred by anti-Black racism, but it is also a history of Black achievement, Black wealth creation, and Black excellence. Black representation in the uppermost echelons of American public life has increased markedly over the past 60 years, and indeed over the past 20 years. This is in part a reflection of the rising share of Black adults with a bachelor's degree, which has increased from 14% in 2000 to 26% in 2022. Over that same period, the median household income for Black families increased by 18%, and the rate of imprisonment fell by 70% for Black women and 48% for Black men. These are very real, concrete material gains, and they're reflected in the cautious optimism many Black Americans express about their own future prospects in survey data. That's the good news. Yet despite these gains, Black Americans express deep pessimism about their status in a diversifying America. Decades after the Civil Rights Revolution, Black Americans continue to perceive a high level of racial discrimination. According to a 2023 Washington Post Ipsos survey, 51% of Black Americans expect racism to get worse during their lifetime, against only 11% who expect racism to diminish. 2/3 of Black adults believe that relations between whites and Blacks are either bad or very bad. And for all the progress Black families have made in the past generation, public discourse tends to focus on the position of Black Americans relative to whites and, increasingly, other groups as well. As Hispanic and Asian Americans are increasingly integrated into the societal mainstream, Black Americans continue to be more isolated, segregated, and disadvantaged than other ethnic and racial groups, a phenomenon that has been dubbed Black exceptionalism. This leaves us with a number of urgent questions. What will it take to fully incorporate Black Americans into the societal mainstream? Or is that even the right objective? When it comes to economic and social outcomes, should we focus on the persistence of group disparities or the pace of absolute gains? How are immigration, domestic migration, and intermarriage remaking Black America? As young working-class Black voters find themselves disillusioned with the Democratic Party, what will become of Black political influence? In the days to come, our speakers will offer provocative, compelling, and at times clashing views on these and other matters. We'll start our program in just a moment with two conversations. The first will be with Coleman Hughes, the nation's leading champion of colorblindness. And now I'm going to walk over here. I'm very pleased to be joined by Coleman Hughes, a contributor to the Free Press, host of the podcast Conversations with Coleman, and author of the important new book, The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. Coleman first rose to prominence as an undergraduate at Columbia, where he challenged what he saw as an excessive emphasis on race and racism in campus discourse. Since then, he has emerged as the nation's most celebrated and most polarizing Gen Z public intellectual. This is despite being an incredibly genial and thoughtful young man, I must say. So, Coleman, you were raised in Montclair, New Jersey, a diverse suburb known for its progressive politics in the 90s and 2000s. This was a milieu full of mixed-race families and friendships, where it really did seem as though people could overcome racial differences. And yet, as a student at an elite prep school, you attended a gathering called the People of Color Conference that offered a very different perspective on race in American life. I'm curious for you to tell us a bit about what you found there and how it reflected or clashed with your experiences growing up in a much coveted community where it kind of seems like America was achieving its highest aspirations.
Yeah, well, first, I have to say that's the first time I've ever been described as a Gen Z intellectual.
You're right on the cusp.
It is technically true. It is an accurate statement. I've just never been described that way, and it's
technically true is what I'm always shooting for.
As a Gen Z intellectual born in the year 96, I was, as you say, born in Montclair, New Jersey, which is one of those towns everyone seems to know. And it's a very diverse town. It was often said growing up that it's a kind of town where mixed race couples move there and gay couples move there because they know it's accepting, and that's true. I grew up with friends of every race, but I did not think of them as belonging to a race. I thought of them as, that's Javier, that's Rodney, that's Nicole. And every year, every Martin Luther King Day in school, we would celebrate, listen to the I Have a Dream speech, feel the sincere goosebumps that most Americans feel when they listen to Dr. King's words. And that was the dominant perspective on race. It was content of character over color of skin. It's not to say there were zero racist incidents. I don't think there ever, any society could ever get to that level, but if ever there was, it was a rare exception that proved the rule, and the whole community would come down and reinforce the essentially colorblind ethic. When I was 16, I went to a private school by that point, and I went to a conference. Actually, it might have been in Dallas. It was in Houston, actually.
Wow.
I was going to say a conference much like this one. Very different kind of conference. A conference for private school kids from all around the nation, where I didn't have this language at the time, but what it was a 2 or 3 day intersectionality critical race theory workshop. I was taught ideas like internalized oppression, the idea that a person of color can espouse what the white supremacists sort of have brainwashed you to think. And I was taught ideas like systemic racism, white privilege. And overall, what I noticed most of all was the difference between what race was in this new environment and what race was at home. At home, your race was something that should never stop you from being friends with anyone. It was a meaningless trait, and who you were, who I was as Coleman was my personal qualities, my values, my interests, my talents. At this conference, my blackness was not viewed as a meaningless trait. Rather, it was viewed as a kind of magic inside my soul, which is to say, if you were anything but white, that identity was seen as kind of a slice of God inside you to be nourished and to be meditated upon. And that was very strange to me. So I went back home thinking that was an interesting little quasi-religious experience. But then I enrolled in Columbia 3 years later and found that it was essentially the dominant culture. And that's right around 2014 when college campuses began to go crazy one after another.
Coleman, I'm curious, when you were there at the conference, did any of it resonate with you at all when you're constantly being told that if you don't embrace this worldview, it's a form of false consciousness? I wonder, I mean, you were a kid at the time. Did you feel at all susceptible to it? Did you find it at all compelling?
I found parts of it emotionally compelling. I'll tell you why. Because you had kids coming to that conference, coming out as gay for the first time in their lives, in tears, crying, coming from places where they felt they would not be accepted. And that was very moving to see. On the other hand, what you had was a kind of dogmatic approach to teaching where anything that was being taught, whether it be systemic racism, white privilege, internalized racism, you couldn't ask a question, right? Normally in school, if the teacher would encourage you to say, well, hold on a second, how do you deal with this point? How do you deal with that point? There was none of that. You could not ask questions. It was assumed that the truth had already been found and it was being imparted to you, which that I really did not like. So the part that resonated with me was that students were coming there with experiences that and identities that they couldn't have at home, and that was moving.
You arrived at Columbia, but you were already at this point an accomplished musician, and as I understand it, you spent some time at Juilliard as well prior to that. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, when you look at the culture of highly competitive music, was that a world that felt different from Columbia at all, or did it feel broadly similar in terms of the kind of ideological complexion and attitudes towards race?
No, it was very different. There was almost no what would later be called wokeness among musicians. It was a very racially diverse set, and I think maybe people may have this experience with tight-knit sports teams or anything that's like a scene, is that because you're all passionate about this higher thing, in my case it was jazz music, and it still is, you're able to connect to people literally across race, across nationality, across even language barriers, because you all love the same thing. And in that context, it's much easier to see through the race fixation that kind of otherwise can consume a culture.
So here I'm going to thoughtlessly generalize, which is always very dangerous. So you arrive at Columbia, and you're not alone. There are many other quote-unquote students of color who are there. Mm-hmm. And typically, these are students who've gone to great schools. These are students who are exceedingly well prepared to be there. They're really smart. They're going places. And yet, you describe a really sour, dark, incredibly pessimistic mood on campus about race, in the campus as a whole and also among these students. Mm-hmm. What is it about the kind of broader American cultural climate that is taking kids who, objectively come from pretty good circumstances? Even if they do come from families that are working class or middle class, here they are in a place where they're getting access to incredible resources. Where's the disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things. So one thing it could be is, and this is the most cynical explanation, is that you have a culture where you can get social capital and clout and respect and status, which we all crave whether or not we admit to craving it. One way of getting that in the culture of a place like Columbia University or Harvard is to play up your oppression. And colloquially, this went by the term the oppression Olympics, right? If I can prove to you if I can say I'm not just black, I'm black and gay, or I'm black and bi, I'm black and queer, I'm black and queer and trans, well then, by the logic of the culture, So this is a term that was in common currency. You were actually using it with your oppression
classmates.
Olympics?
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, but it was the culture.
Yeah.
It was the culture. And so kids, we would critique it privately to our friends that we knew we could critique it in front of. And often there would be this moment where you meet a friend on campus and you both realize that you're okay with critiquing the thing. And then you both breathe a sigh of relief, realizing that you're kind of safe to talk. But truthfully, it's probably the majority of students were comfortable critiquing the thing, right? That's how the dynamics work often is like a small set of students feel something really strongly, but they're only 5%, but it puts a chill over everyone, and it makes them seem like they represent everyone.
So was the Oppression Olympics about impressing your peers, or was it about impressing authority figures and gaining admission to this or that program, gaining the approval of your professors?
Both, yeah. It was there were a lot of professors that directly incentivized that. I'll give you one very concrete example. I took a class called Philosophy of Feminism, which I didn't want to take, but one of my friends persuaded me to take it. And I said, okay, I'll take it with you. And we were both black students. And on the final exam, the last essay question, which made up a huge slice of the test grade, was name and analyze a time where you suffered as a result of the white cis heteropatriarchy. Now, thank my lucky stars, I happen to be black and Hispanic and could pull some experience of being something other than white. What was the white guy, the straight white guy in that class supposed to do? Just sit on his hands and just get and there were so many signals of that in this class where it was told in not in so many words that in this context, it's better for you to be black, it's better for you to be gay than straight, it's better. And this always struck me as very strange because I agree with Zora Neale Hurston's words in her memoir where she said, you know, I'm of the radical belief that black people are no better or worse than any other group of people, and on and on. That would be a concrete example.
In 2013, at the start of Barack Obama's second term in office, large majorities of black Americans and white Americans said that race relations were in pretty good shape. They were headed in a good direction. And today, 10 years later, that's true of only a small minority of blacks and whites. Mm-hmm. You describe how you went to this little fringy people of color conference as a kid, then suddenly go to Columbia, and these ideas and attitudes have kind of colonized this elite university. You know, now it seems like these ideas have gone national.
Yeah.
And I'm curious why you think there's been such a deterioration, such a collapse. You know, you wrote a brilliant piece that actually inspired the name of this discussion, The Case for Black Optimism, when you were an undergrad at Columbia, just giving statistic after statistic, documenting really dramatic gains that black Americans had made in America over the last 20 or so years. Mm-hmm. And yet you have this incredible mood of pessimism. So where does it come from?
Yeah, so as you say, I think this is very important to emphasize. In 2013, the majority of Americans of all races believed race relations were good. Majority of black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans. Not only that, if you have 2013 here and you just start looking like, you know, from the 90s and you ask the question, is bias the big problem you face? And Pew did this. Every year, you just saw fewer and fewer black people saying bias is the main issue they face, to the point where you had 60% in 2013. Clear majority saying bias is not the main issue that they face in housing and so forth. So what happened, right? We seemed like everything was going in the right direction. Is it that racism suddenly spiked around 2013 and, well, no, it turns out the best explanation of what happened is that 2013 was around the year that everyone and their mother had two pieces of critical new technology which fundamentally changed people's beliefs for the worse, in my view. That is camera-enabled smartphones and social media. So we all lived through this transition here in this room, but it's useful to just emphasize how much changed because it's easy to forget. If something happened in Dallas, Texas tonight between a police officer and a black unarmed suspect, and the altercation went left, some incident happened, and it was 2005, how would you learn about that, if you would learn about it at all? Well, it might be in the local Dallas newspaper. It might make the next local 6 o'clock news, but by the time it was on the news, there would have been journalists there to ask the police what happened, ask the family what happened, put journalistic context, and give you some close to fact-based account of what happened. Now, say the identical thing happens in the year 2014. Now that you have smartphones and social media, what happens is probably someone started filming it the second it started heating up, recorded a clip of the interaction that was selective and probably omitted how the whole thing began, uploads that clip immediately to Facebook where it gets millions of views before a journalist has done any question asking and context creation. And now that's been fed through an algorithm that preferentially boosts content that is going to upset you, because that's the content that gets the most engagement. So there was a fundamental shift in the way information spread. What happened is not that reality on the ground changed. What happened is the way we consumed information changed, and that led to the misperception that racism was on the rise, that it was open season on cops killing black people. And everything that happened after 2013 with declining race relations, the statistics you cited about pessimism, it's all downstream of that. And now one objection people have when I make this argument is that, well, actually what happened is smartphones and social media revealed all of the racism that was already out there, and now it's just that we could finally see it. Well, if that were true, you would expect in the post-social media world, you'd expect people to have a more accurate perception of the basic facts of the situation. That's a testable proposition. It's been tested, and it's not true. I think it was the Skeptic Research Center. Actually, Manhattan Institute had a fantastic, Eric Kaufman did a fantastic report on this. One thing he cites is the Skeptic Research Institute. They asked the question of very liberal Americans who are the most online, how many unarmed black people do you think are shot by the cops every year? And they returned the answer 1,000. The real number that year was 12. So this social media revolution, smartphone and social media revolution that changed how we get information, it didn't make us smarter or more accurate. It actually gave us a misimpression and led us, so many of us, to believe that there was a crisis of white supremacy where actually no such crisis existed.
It was striking not long ago when there was an incident captured via smartphone of police brutality in the city of Memphis, where it was a group of black police officers who were mistreating a black suspect. And it was really striking that it just did not resonate in the same way. It did not spread the same way. It did not spark the same kind of cultural conversation or reflection, I wonder what you think about that, because that was a really striking, vivid set of images that you'd think would make the blood boil, and yet it's not something that was embraced by activists and political entrepreneurs in the same way.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, of all the videos of police, alleged and real police brutality in the BLM era, that video is up there with potentially the worst of them. And there was, if I recall, there was really no valid defense of what was done there, right? I'm not even sure people really tried to defend it, other than police unions who have to do that. But you raise a good point. Why is it that we truthfully, we only care when the racial dynamics are a certain way? When it's a white cop doing something to a black suspect.
So it has to fit a certain narrative script that people have in their minds, and that's when you pay attention.
Absolutely. I think as Americans, we grow up, many of us grow up seeing videos of civil rights protesters being hosed down, of peaceful, black protesters at Selma being abused by white racist cops, and that creates a very strong imprint on how we think and how we feel. And I think when people see something superficially similar to that, they feel all those same feelings. And the problem is that that feeling is not necessarily a good map onto what the problem is. So, for example, 3 or 4 years before George Floyd died, a white man named Tony Timpa died in almost identical circumstances with a knee on the back of his neck for 13 minutes. And the cops were, in that case, were actually making fun of him as he died. And that happened in Dallas, as a matter of fact. All caught on camera. It's on YouTube. You can find it. But nobody cared. Didn't make any national attention. And irony is, if it had, then it might have led to a kind of reflection on police tactics that could have saved Floyd's life. But yeah, I think we have to get past this idea that we care if the victim is black, but we don't care if the victim is white. We have to. All the emotional reaction is understandable, but our better nature, our better angels, have to kick in and tell us that it should not matter the color of your skin if you're suffering some particular malady or some particular abuse. Like that might be an operating system we have emotionally, but we have to update that software using our rational minds.
Your book, The End of Race Politics, is a manifesto for colorblindness. As you observed here and elsewhere, colorblindness is deeply out of style. On the racial justice left, it's commonplace to argue that to disregard race is to perpetuate and entrench racial inequality. How do you define colorblindness, and why are you so keen to defend it when so many credentialed, serious academics, kind of thought leaders are insisting that colorblindness is the vehicle through which we reproduce racial injustice?
Yeah, well, the credentialed people are wrong. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that a lot of people have equated colorblindness to "I don't see race," and I don't like that phrase. I think it's misleading, and I think it provides too convenient a target for critics of colorblindness, because they can just come back and say, "Of course you see race." Like, does Raihan look like, a white woman? No, he looks like a South Asian man. Like we can see that, so let's not deny that we see it. Obviously, I know what people mean by it. They mean it metaphorically, but it's too easy a target to knock down. So in my view, colorblindness is not pretending not to see race. It's not "I don't see race." It's I try to treat you without regard to race. And I demand that of you in return, and we both demand that of the state. And wherever the state has an interest, a legitimate evidence-based interest in correcting for societal disadvantages, they should do that on the basis of income and socioeconomic class. That's colorblindness as I define it. Now, the reason people have been against colorblindness, so many scholars in the academy, take someone like Kimberly Crenshaw, the founder of intersectionality and one of the key founders of critical race theory. Those ideologies, especially CRT, if you go back and read their sort of founding documents, they define their philosophy in opposition to colorblindness. They created the philosophy because they felt colorblindness was not enough. The civil rights movement didn't go far enough. And so what they wanted to say was that colorblindness is this conservative reactionary idea. It's just a bunch of old white guys that actually didn't really like the civil rights movement who invented this colorblindness idea as a Trojan horse for reactionary white supremacy. So I went back and actually looked at what is it that civil rights leaders actually said, going all the way back to the end of slavery. You find that Wendell Phillips, who was the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society after William Lloyd Garrison, he was not just a prominent abolitionist, he was the radical wing of the abolitionist movement who believed that Black Americans should immediately get the full right to vote in 1865. He's the first person that I'm aware of who mentioned the term colorblindness in 1865, I believe, asking for what he called a government colorblind. That is, a government that could not distinguish in its laws between black and white. So the roots of colorblindness is not what the critical race theory people say it is. It's actually, the roots of the philosophy are in the abolition movement.
One line of argument you'll often hear from critics of colorblindness, and you had a really fascinating debate with Jamel Bowie not long ago, sponsored by TED, is that when you're looking at racial disadvantage and racial disparities, they are self-reinforcing. They can become more entrenched over time. And the only way to really combat them is to embrace race-conscious policies that target that racial injury. So if you do things that are purely based on income or wealth, they're not actually going to get at the root of the problem. What's your response?
I'd argue it's precisely backwards. Socioeconomics is much closer to the root of the problem. So for example, a black kid like me grew up upper middle class. Whatever metric identifies the disadvantaged Americans that need state intervention and state help should not have identified me. Now, if the way that you're identifying the disadvantaged, because let me just back up. I think most people, not everyone, but most people from across the political aisle would agree that in some situations the government has an interest in helping those who can't help themselves in some way, shape, or form. We might not agree on how, we might not agree on when, but broadly, there are situations where the government needs to help. The question is now, how do you identify who needs help? You have to have some kind of proxy, right? So implicit in our system of race-based public policies is the idea, the claim that race is the best proxy for who is disadvantaged. In other words, when we ask who is disadvantaged, we ought to ask, that's the same as asking who is black and who is Hispanic in this situation. My argument is that that's not the best proxy for disadvantage and that class is a better proxy. Identifying people that are poor, either whether it's income or wealth or some combination measure, or even factoring in the level of crime in the neighborhood you grew up in. You can get as sophisticated as you want with these kinds of measures. That is a better proxy for who we mean when we talk about the disadvantaged. And that actually is much closer to the root of the problem in America, which is, intergenerational poverty in communities that are sometimes rife with drugs, rife with crime. That's the root of the problem.
Two more questions for you before I turn it to the audience. First is a personal question. You were recently on a television program called The View, which some of you in this room may have heard of, and you had a really spirited exchange with one of the co-hosts in which, and I don't want to be unfair, but it seemed that she essentially accused you of being a traitor to black people, and she seemed to suggest that you were a puppet, that you were essentially being used by various shadowy right-wing malefactors somewhere behind a curtain.
She would love to see that I'm in this room right now. This would prove it to her.
So, have at it. I mean, I'm curious how you feel about that accusation, because it really does seem as though one way that political dissenters in a community are punished is through this accusation of treachery, of betrayal, of the idea that you are not behaving in a solidaristic way that is uplifting the race. And I wonder how you feel about that when you get that kind of accusation. And you've been getting that for as long as you've been writing for the public.
Yeah, I have been getting that for a long time. I hate it. I think it's such. First of all, it's a way of not responding to my arguments, which is what I told her, and I think what people found interesting about that interaction is I calmly told her, look, you may not know much about me. I've only voted twice for president because of my age, both for Democrats, though I would vote Republican in theory. I'm an independent, so I view myself as a winnable voter. I'm an analyst for CNN. I write for the Free Press. Neither of those is a right-wing institution. So as a matter of fact, I don't think that you can say I'm right-wing. Though if I were, that wouldn't in any way invalidate the arguments I'm making, right? So let's get back to the topic here, is essentially what I told her. And I don't think she expected that kind of a reaction. Broadly, I make the arguments that I make because I really feel them. I feel that they are better for Americans as a whole and Black Americans in particular. And I do find it rich that the people who are so quick to throw that kind of race traitor epithet at you, whether they say Uncle Tom or merely whisper it in their minds, are the same people that, in many cases, simply deny some of the biggest problems, the biggest ways in which the Black American community is suffering. I mean, for instance, the fact that so few people in media talk about or even acknowledge the fact that in the year 2020, as a result of the overall attitude and policies toward police, you saw the greatest year-over-year increase in the homicide rate in over 100 years of American history, highly concentrated in Black communities. The fact that such people are silent on that rather minor detail of Black suffering is incredible to me, and then can turn around and call someone like me a race traitor. It's really absurd, and I think people need to just stop that.
We've established, despite your protestations, that you are in fact a member of Gen Z. And I wonder, when you look to Gen Z, this is an incredibly diverse generation. This is, if you buy into the conventional racial categories invented by the census, a majority-minority generation. When you think about this cohort, which is very much a product of intermarriage, immigration, just a larger cultural intermingling, larger cultural transformation, does it make you feel more optimistic that maybe some of these kind of rigid racial lines will loosen? Does it make you more optimistic that you'll be able to persuade younger Americans of the virtues of colorblindness? Or do you think that that's ultimately immaterial?
What's ultimately immaterial? The fact that they're a majority minority?
Exactly, in the demographic shifts.
That's interesting. I'm not actually, I don't really have an opinion on how the demographic shift is going to affect what people believe. I'm curious to see what Gen Z kind of ends up believing and what Gen Z's politics end up being, because it doesn't seem obvious to me, and it doesn't seem that it would flow logically from their demographics. So you could picture it going either way. You could see it being a group of minority kids, more minority kids than any previous generation, and they're all hook, line, and sinker on the idea that white supremacy is the problem. But you could easily see it going in the opposite direction, where their life experience, daily proves that racism has massively declined, though it can never be fully eliminated, and that maybe they just want to get on with the whole thing. So I could definitely see it going either way.
I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you. So just preface the question by echoing Robert's point that you do have some academic eggheads in the House. So I'm going to ask you a question about the causal direction of what you started with, which is this change in technology and what's driving some of this. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of identity politics. And I wonder what you think about the idea that we've been reading in the news recently that non-white Americans are increasingly open to not voting strictly Democratic. You talked about that just a minute ago. Do you think that it's possible that some of the effort to make these incidents that you cite as being rare go viral is coming from the top down, from elites who are worried about the end of being able to use identity to drive people to vote a certain way, as opposed to the alternative, which is, do you think that this came more from the bottom up, that people authentically saw these things that you were talking about on social media and it really struck a chord with them? Is it more a top-down or more a bottom-up explanation, do you think?
I think that it is probably more bottom-up, in the sense that I think really around 2013 and 2014, you had the first algorithmically boosted social media feeds, and I think that the videos of Black Americans getting killed or harmed or simply arrested by cops tapped into something in the average person scrolling. Now, the response from elites was to accept that uncritically and feed it back and perpetuate it and amplify it for many, many years. So, but ultimately, no, I think it starts bottom up.
I'm just curious whether you know what it's like in Montclair, New Jersey now.
I don't get back very much, unfortunately. That's a good question.
Yes, I'm wondering what you think of two things. One is that the refusal to ever incorporate behavioral requirements into government policies. And secondly, I think there's this feeling among liberals that Black Americans cannot meet merit-based standards, whether it's law school, social work, certification exams. That's why I think that there's been this emphasis on race to cloud up these 2 points of refusal to change behaviors in policies. Just say, if you get this, if you change behavior, whether it's housing, whether it's the child care credit.
Right. I guess I can address your second point, I think, more directly. Yes, I think what I think a liberal on race issues would say is that no, it's not that we've given up on the idea that Black people can meet meritocratic standards. Is that, you know, there's so much racism out there that that we need race-based policies to correct it. So that's the story. That's the liberal story for why liberals support lowering standards across the board for race. However, I'm not sure that totally makes sense of why, for years, liberals said that Black people can't get driver's licenses, which is not a very difficult, it's a very annoying thing to do, as you know, to go to the DMV, but it's not a difficult thing to do, and it is somewhat insulting to say that Black Americans can't do it, can't get access to it. And I found during COVID in New York City, there was a period for many, many months where you needed a Vax card and a driver's license or an ID to get into any restaurant, gym, bar, et cetera, in the city due to the restrictions. And I noticed none of the people who for years had been saying Black people can't get IDs said anything about this, because logically, if they really believed it, they should have said, well, hold on a second. Aren't we roping off the entire city to our Black residents since they're not going to have the IDs with the Vax cards? So I think probably it was not really, it was either not a sincerely held belief or it was a sincerely held belief, in which case your theory of lowering standards, you know, would make more sense, which is that there is a quiet sense that Black Americans are a lost cause and achievement will never rise, so we might as well just lower standards. On the other hand, I think, you know, Roland Fryer, I don't know if he's here yet, but he'll speak soon, and he's done some, I think, the most impressive research on the specific ways in which you can get students from disadvantaged backgrounds to raised to meet meritocratic benchmarks, and I think that's where the conversation should be.
Thank you. So you mentioned the conference you went to when you were in high school. It talked about race and then also, you know, sexual orientation, gender identity. I'm curious whether you see or saw on Columbia's campus gender identity supersede race when it comes to sort of intersectional poker. So to put it a different way, I'm of the opinion that white and trans beats Black and Christian today. And I'm just curious whether that's something that you saw, and how do you see that playing out sort of in the future in terms of sexual politics colonizing sort of the gains of the civil rights movement?
Well, Christian was actually a demerit when you were at. So I'm an atheist. I grew up with no religion, and I don't believe. But I would notice those rare few times I would meet Christian kids on Columbia's campus, they would keep their Christianity very, very deep below the surface, and you'd have to pull it out of them that they even believed in God because they were embarrassed to admit it. So that was not a plus. On the other hand, being queer was seen as a huge plus, and queer was the word that was used often. And the funny thing about it is that whereas gay, bi, and lesbian have very clear meanings to me, as does straight, queer had no particular meaning. What it meant, it didn't necessarily mean you could be straight and queer if you dressed a certain way and hung out with a certain crowd. And that was a way that people got social class. It only sort of suggested that you might be other than straight. As far as has it colonized the gains of the civil rights movement, it's definitely become a huge part of the conversation. When I was at Columbia, I still think the race issue was probably somewhat deeper and primary, but it was followed very closely by the issue of sexuality, trans identity, and so forth.
We have a few hands over here.
Sorry, thank you. What has the impact of non-black, non-white people like me and Rayhan, been on the national conversation, the national arm wrestling on colorblindness, in your opinion?
I think primarily it's been a thorn in the side of the liberal anti-racist narrative for a few reasons. One, because so many non-white, non-black, that's a good term. That's a very American term. The mere fact that so many immigrants from India, from Africa, from other places in South Asia want to come here so badly, and that it's still pretty much the primary destination for the world's striving migrants, says something about our attitude towards race, right? It would be difficult for that to be true if it were also true that it was a kind of white supremacist hellscape here. That wouldn't act like a bug light for the world's black and brown migrants, right? So there's that. There is the perpetual problem of quote unquote overachievement of certain model minorities, Indian Americans being the highest earning ethnic group in the country, not exactly what you'd predict in a white supremacist nation either. And I also, I noticed when I was a student at Columbia, we started a discussion club called Colloquia, because we noticed you couldn't talk about anything in class. So we started a club where you could actually talk about stuff. And we would debate topics and had a great time. And I used to joke that it was, I called it Indian Club sometimes because there's so many Indian students there.
So since you went to that conference when you were in high school, I think everyone in the room could acknowledge that we have seen a lot of those ideas move into the mainstream. You've had universities and corporate boards embracing DEI. You've got these issues kind of coloring how it's covered in journalism. Do you have some sense that Americans are starting to get the idea that this framework that was presented as sort of fighting the power is actually representative of the power structure? Like it is the power.
Yes, I think that's right. I would not have said that 4 or 5 years ago when I started writing about this topic, but I think it's become clear just in the past year or two that a critical mass of people has woken up and I guess found the confidence is really the key point, because there have been skeptics of what variously called wokeness, social justice, DEI, CRT. There have been plenty of skeptics, including among Democrats, for many, many years. But to have the confidence to voice publicly that you're a skeptic, that's something that a critical mass of people have just developed really in the past year. I mean, to think that you could have a serious movement, not just of conservatives, but also of independents and some Democrats critiquing DEI would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. So I absolutely think people have woken up and realized that a lot of the people claiming to be disempowered, the disempowered elites, have been, running the show in some sense at corporations, at colleges, and so forth, and that they may not have been having such a great impact on our conversation and our ability to get along with one another.
Assuming you read it, what did you think of Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, where she took the analogy about where we all are in America compared to India? You reminded me of where, the caste system there and what happened in Germany at one point. Mm-hmm. Have you read it by any chance?
No, I haven't. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read it. But taking the argument as you presented it, I think it's absurd. America is so far ahead of India in terms of integrating and I guess you could say valorizing, honoring, and so forth, Black Americans, as opposed to India's slow, piecemeal integration of its Dalit class, which one used to call untouchable. I guess some may still call it that. I think there's no comparison. I mean, there's no comparison to the level to which the average American is aware of the racism of the past and feels, at least some burden to care about it is absolutely not comparable to what is true. I mean, just look at Bollywood movies versus Hollywood movies. I don't think you're going to find like routine on TV in India untouchables as actors. I think there was one Dalit Supreme Court justice, which was a huge deal. So that's where they're at. We're at the point where Black president, Black vice president, multiple Black Supreme Court justices. I grew up, when I was a kid, I used to love the show House. And it's like the smartest doctor besides House on the show is Foreman, who is Black. And it didn't even occur to me as a kid to think, well, oh, isn't that great? The smartest character in the show is Black. It was just normal. And that's the year 2000 or so. So there's no comparison.
We have time for, we'll go with two final questions. First, the gentleman back there, and then at this table here.
Thank you. So as you know, last year the Supreme Court effectively abolished affirmative action, race-based affirmative action in college admissions. We'll talk a little bit about this on a panel tomorrow, but I'm curious, there's a suggestion that as a result of that, racial diversity is going to decline, particularly at the most selective colleges and universities around the country, Columbia being one of them. My question for you is, do you think that's right? Is that going to happen? And more importantly, if it does, is that a problem?
Okay, so the first is asking me to predict, do I think it will? I try not to make predictions if I don't have a strong view. What I will say is, if colleges are facing competing incentives. One is to not face lawsuits over what they really want to do, which is maintain the same student diversity through racial preferences. But the competing incentive is to maintain a diverse student population via some method that doesn't directly discriminate. And in principle, that should be legal, right? If you instead have some admissions policy where you're saying we're going to take the top admit the top 5% of students at every high school. Well, that's not racially discriminating. It will have a disparate impact, but it should be nothing illegal about that. So if they become clever, it might not decline so much. The question is, how clever are they willing to be? Are they willing to be so clever that they risk lawsuits on the other end? And I don't actually know the answer to that. I think time will tell. And then the second question, would it be bad if racial diversity did decline at Harvard and Columbia? I don't, it's not that it would make me, it might make me feel bad to see it, but if I actually think about, like, what is the crucial benefit of Harvard being, 14% Black American? I don't know. We have quite a schizophrenic attitude towards diversity. On the one thing, I will hear, members of my family went to Howard and Spelman, which are extremely non-diverse places. They are historically Black colleges and universities, and had a lovely time at those places, had an incredibly valuable time. I've never, ever heard someone say that Earth, Wind, and Fire was really great, but they really needed actually a white guy in the band. Or that the Beatles were great, but they really needed a Hispanic guy. So in my view, I view racial diversity is kind of like love, which is, if it happens naturally, it's the most beautiful thing in the world. And where it is unforced, it is amazing to learn from people of different cultures and so forth. But if you are forcing it via racial discrimination, you've somewhat missed the point. That's what I would say.
Well, I have to say, I have never heard a more extraordinary Q&A than the one you have given us for the last half hour.
Big praise.
And the second thing I will say is, it's not a fair question. You've been beat up from all sorts of different sides. You've been praised from all sorts of different sides. Looking ahead 10, 20 years, don't give me a glib answer, but you haven't given any glib answers so far, so I'll trust you. Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm an optimist. The reason I'm an optimist has more to do with that I think the fundamentals of America are sound, and that, with a strong economy, with the inertia of our historical, what you might call it, functionality, the fact that we're still such a highly sought after place. My view is that the fundamentals of the country, which are fundamentally sound, will swamp out and solve all of the issues, not all of the issues, but will be more important than the issues that constantly arise. And so I have faith in the broad, the broad power of the American project and the American economy and the American political system. I think when one focuses on I think it was Kahneman who recently passed away, who had what he called the focusing illusion, which was one of his famous cognitive biases, which is that nothing is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it. So I think as a social scientist, or as someone that reads a lot of social science, you are thinking about problems your whole life. And so it's possible to become unfairly pessimistic and forget that ultimately America is an engine that has been working for 250 years. And it's gotten through worse problems in the past than we've had now. And I'm not saying it'll last forever, but I am optimistic about the near future.
Please join me in thanking Coleman Hughes.